Good afternoon. You have the rare opportunity this afternoon to see a living Oriole. You've got these two Creighton experts and professionals on each side, and then you got me in the middle. A high school educated, came through the back shop newspaper guy, not a journalist, newspaper guy. So I'm going to talk about freedom of the press. Although it is a key element of our Constitution, contrary to what many people believe, freedom of the press was not an original American idea. One of the earliest defenses of freedom of the press came in 1644 when the English poet John Milton wrote in one of his many poems, "Truth and understanding are not wares to be monopolized." Milton was responding to the British Parliament's passage of a new law requiring government to approve all books prior to publication. In other words, Milton was against the establishment of government censorship. The first law recognizing freedom of the press wasn't enacted for another 120 years. It came in 1776 when the Swedish Parliament passed legislation establishing the first Freedom of the Press Act. That new law, ironically, abolished the Swedish government's role as censor of printed materials. 25 years later, framers of the U.S. Constitution enshrined that principle in the document's First Amendment, which reads in part, "Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press." In the beginning, the primary focus of the press, freedom of the press, was very simple. It provided for the right to report news and circulate opinion without censorship from the government. That was the core of freedom of the press. Over time, it has grown to cover some other things. Freedom of the press now plays a critical role in holding government accountable to the people. A free press functions as a watchdog that can investigate and, when discovered, report government wrongdoing. As the country's watchdog, the press, all forms of media, not just newspapers, have been quite successful in their efforts. Perhaps the most famous example is the Watergate investigation conducted by the Washington Post that eventually led to President Richard Nixon's resignation. But there have been many others. Unfortunately, it's not easy to be an effective watchdog. Many in government don't like being held accountable, having their actions questioned, or being forced to disclose information. It is a constant battle at all levels of the government. In the 1950s, before Congress enacted the Freedom of Information Act, the American Society of Newspaper Editors formed the Freedom of Information Committee. That committee, over the next several years, pressured state legislatures into enacting open meeting laws as part of a general move towards a more responsive and responsible government. By 1976, all 50 states and the District of Columbia had passed sunshine laws that protects the people's legal right to limited access of public information. In general, most statutes require public bodies to meet and to deliberate in public, and most of the laws apply to the disclosure of public information. But even with such laws, battles between the media and the government continue. Here in Iowa, in a lawsuit filed this week, Governor Kim Reynolds' office has been accused of illegally delaying the release of public records related to the state's $26 million no-bid coronavirus contract. Paul Huntsman, chairman of the board of the Salt Lake Tribune newspaper, is funding the challenge and is vowing to make the findings public. Huntsman says he wants to know how well the program worked, and more importantly, whether public funds were used for private gain. The complaint alleges that Reynolds' office has, for more than 5 months, refused to timely and meaningfully respond to a records request related to the Test Iowa program. At this point, the suit doesn't claim any misconduct on the part of the governor or the program. The suit only addresses Reynolds' office's refusal to release the requested information. And nothing attracts the media more than a politician or a government agency who refuses to release public information. I'd like to point out that Huntsman is seeking the same information from several other states. Iowa is not in the boat by themselves. These types of suits are not limited to high elective office. Many, in fact most, such suits are local, between local media, local city, county, or school governments. In Iowa, the continuous refusal of certain government officials to release public information was so frequent that the state actually created an independent board to act as an arbitrator between the media and government agencies. The Public Information Board is governed by a 9-member panel appointed by the state's governor and confirmed by the state Senate. No more than 3 members of the board shall be from the media. No more than 3 members are to represent counties, cities, or other governments. The members are staggered 4-year terms and are balanced by political party and gender. I haven't quite figured out how you balance a 9-member board by gender, but I'm working on it. The board's jurisdiction is limited to issues involving open meetings and public records, and complaints must be filed within 60 days of the alleged violation. It's a great service. But even with the Iowa Board of Public Information, a good number of battles end up in court, just as I suspect Huntsman's battle with Governor Reynolds' office will end up in court. Such battles are not limited to Iowa. They occur all across the country at all levels of government, including the highest office in the land. Numerous freedom of information battles have been fought with numerous national administrations, both Republican and Democratic. When I was asked to give this presentation, it was suggested I close with thoughts about the future of the freedom of the press. My crystal ball isn't any clearer than anyone else's, but I have to admit, I have concerns as to if the freedom of the press can be preserved. I want to give you, what I'm about to give you are my personal thoughts from being in the business for 50 years. Media is and has always been about audience. The larger the audience, the more potential for profit. When there were multiple newspapers in nearly every community in this country, the battle was simply over readers. As an example, I began my career in my hometown of Farmington, Missouri in 1970. The town only had a population of 5,200 people, but there were 3 newspapers serving that community, and there was always a battle to see who would garner the most readers. Although there are fewer newspapers today, when you combine newspapers with all the radio stations, the hundreds of TV options, the abundance of online websites, podcasters, bloggers, and so-called news feeds, the battle for audience has skyrocketed. And with audience share becoming more and more challenging, some entities are trying new approaches to gain audience share, some of which are both misleading and, frankly, downright dishonest. It's also important to remember that media and politics have been married at the hip since the creation of media and politics. Each depends on the other as their way to thrive and survive. Newspapers, without being able to cover government, wouldn't be where they are today. And politicians, without being endorsed and promoted and covered by the media, wouldn't be where they are today. You know that old line, it doesn't matter what they say about me as long as they keep talking about me. That came from a politician referring to the newspaper. In the late 1700s and the early 1800s, political parties actually sponsored many of the community newspapers. They did so as a way to reach their loyal participants, their loyal patrons. Editors typically became the local party spokesman. Now get that. The newspaper editor became the party spokesman in the community. And hard-hitting editorials were commonplace. And they were reprinted from one paper to the other, but only if the editorial was in support of the party sponsoring that newspaper. Even when I started my career, nearly every newspaper claimed some sort of political party allegiance. Those 3 newspapers in my hometown, 2 were Republican, while the 3rd favored Democratic policies. The editors were no longer the official party spokesman, and hard-hitting editorials were far less frequent. But each newspaper still supported the ideas and practices put forth by the party they favored. Here's another truth. News in most papers was far too often slanted, but it was seldom fake. I'll illustrate what I mean. Let's assume that there are 2 parties. One is the Rotary Party, and the other is the Kiwanis Party. And each have a newspaper that support their beliefs. And the Rotary Party announced that they're going to try to raise some money to help the community. They've set an all-time record of $100,000. And if successful, they're going to do 10 wonderful things for their community. Later, when the campaign is over, the Rotarian paper announces that the Rotary did not meet its goal. But here's how they announce it. They forget about the goal and they say, Rotary Club raises record $87,000. We'll do 7 great things for the community. The Kiwanis paper says, Rotary Club fails to reach 100,000. 3 promises will go unkept. The facts are the same. You read the story. They said they were going to raise 100,000. They said they'd do 10 things. They only raised 87, so they're only going to do 7. But how you slant the story changes the perception of the news. And that has gone on for a long, long time. Paul Harvey, for those of you who have the same color hair as myself, may remember that he was one of the most successful radio announcers in radio history. His show, Paul Harvey's News and Views, was a combination of actual factual news and personal opinion, but it was never difficult to distinguish one from the other. Now that is out the window. Talking heads on cable TV, radio talk show hosts, and to my disappointment, even some newspapers, along with countless social media outlets, manipulate the facts to create the story they want. While based on some small amount of fact, these practices have created an abundance of false and misleading information. I tell people today it only takes an ounce of truth to make a pound of poop. Some forget about the one truth. They just say whatever they want. They have little interest in facts and no concerns about lying or misleading. To make matters worse, the result is, unlike Paul Harvey, their views are presented as the news. Sometimes it appears they are trying to further a political agenda, but in reality, more times than not, it's mostly done in an effort to maintain or build audience share. They don't care about your philosophy or your neighbor's philosophy. They only care if you listen, watch, or read them. It's all about audience, and audience is all about profit. Sadly, such efforts are being helped along because too many readers, viewers, and listeners no longer themselves care about facts. They simply want their own beliefs reinforced. They have allowed their open-mindedness to be replaced by fears that their philosophy won't be the majority philosophy. And let's not forget about the outside influencers. Whether either the Russians or the Chinese or some group we have yet to hear about, make no mistake, they are working to undermine truth and create friction in our country. And sadly, they've been pretty successful. I'm afraid they've gotten far too many of us to become our own worst enemy. Today, far too many people believe the press is the enemy, that all of our problems somehow stem from the actions of the press. Well, the press isn't pure. This false accusation has only come about in an effort to deflect people from the truth. After all, it can't be true if it comes from the enemy. Actions taken by many in the battle for audience and the efforts by some to deflect people from the truth, I believe threatens the future existence of freedom of the press. How will the courts be able to defend or justify freedom of the press if the freedom is abused and used improperly? I doubt they will be able to do so. And I will close with this thought. If freedom of the press disappears, so will many of our other cherished freedoms. If you can't print about it, you won't be able to talk about it. Freedom of the speech will disappear, along with the right to question government actions. And if that happens, what will our country be then? Freedom of the press does not make a country perfect, far from it. But from what I've seen in my 50-year career, freedom of the press has made our country better, stronger, safer, and more productive than all the countries combined that don't enjoy freedom of the press. If you don't agree with me, I invite you to visit Afghanistan in about 3 weeks. Thank you.